All right. Sorry for being a couple minutes late there, but welcome to the Off by One security stream. Can I get a couple comments from folks? If you are hearing me and seeing me in my screen share, just send a note through the chat. Let me know everything looks good because I was just having some connectivity issues and I want to make sure that they are gone before we start here. And as usual, it takes like 10 or 15 seconds for a comment to come in through StreamYard for whatever reason. So I'm just going to give it a moment here, make sure a couple folks can hear me, and then we will get going. Yes, we can hear and see you. Okay, cool. Well, if one person can, that must be good enough. So hopefully that means more can. So all right. As I just tweeted, if you happen to catch that, this one's going to be a bit more of a technical stream. As I'm sure you've seen in the past, some of them are quite technical, some of them a little bit more high level, and kind of weave in and out. Also, it depends on if I'm going to have a guest or not. This particular one, it's just me and myself and I've got a couple cool confirmations coming up, though. I've got Kuba Gretzky, who I've mentioned before, who is the author of Evil Jinx, which is an amazing tool for multi-factor authentication bypass and such, and he is going to be coming on. I've got the date. I think we're doing March 1st. So it's a little bit away from right now, but he's got a lot of work he's doing in the interim. But got him locked in now. So unless something changes, March 1st is when I'll have him on. And I've also got some other guests to announce soon. Hopefully, we're going to have the author here of GEF, which is a great exploit development assistant tool. You might have heard of other ones like PETA, the Python Exploit Development Assistant. Jeff is an even better one, in my opinion, and it's just got a ton of great features. So I'm hoping to have him on to show us some of the great things that maybe we don't know as much about with regard to features to help us out with exploit dev on Linux. So this particular stream, I've done a series of streams you may have noticed on exploit mitigations. For whatever reason, that just happens to be an area that I am quite interested in, and it's multiple reasons why it's interesting. I guess some of these mitigations are enforced by the kernel. Some of the mitigations are enforced in user land, and this goes all the way back to a tool called um, Emmet, the Enhanced Mitigation Experience Toolkit, which was Microsoft's kind of flagship exploit mitigation toolkit that has all these I can't say cutting edge, I guess, but like more contemporary, also sometimes more risky mitigations that you can turn on that do actually stop some 0 days. Like they're quite effective. I remember Microsoft a long time ago in Windows 7 did a a paper, or released a paper, a little study that showed that, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but they took a fully unpatched Windows 7 system. They turned Emmet on with all the mitigations, and they ran somewhere close to 100 exploits against the unpatched Windows system. So patches are available for all these exploits, but leaving it unpatched intentionally, see if the toolkit would stop a lot of those attacks. And it ended up stopping something like 90% of the attacks it prevented from exploitation being successful, which validates and proves that for the majority of 0 days, or if you're on an unpatched system, if you're running these mitigations the way that you're supposed to, it should stop the majority of them, which is really neat, and justifies its existence. You've probably heard me say before as well. The problem is some of these mitigations will break your applications, and I've said this many times in the past. It's kind of hard to expect Windows administrators who have a full-time job to have the level of technical understanding as to how these mitigations work at a low enough level to, one, determine what the overhead might be associated with it, two, to see whether or not it might break an application, because obviously you don't want to do the screen test and just turn it on. So you've got to do testing to make sure it doesn't break things. And three, understand the effectiveness of these controls. Like, you have to balance the performance hit along with the security that you get from it, and make a decision on behalf of your company, right? So it's a balance of a bunch of things. And back to my point, it's hard to expect a administrator opportunity, of course, for the offense to work with the defense and help each other out. But even on the offensive side, most most of us don't go into the level of detail that we're going to go into on this stream. Um, and what I mean by that is this particular mitigation that we're going to look at today, which is export address table filtering, I haven't looked at this one. I've got some assumptions about it. And here's the thing: when you go and Google one of these mitigations that we've been talking about on these streams, you'll find very little information about it. Most of it's just like people rehashing what Microsoft already said about it, which historically has been very minimal. They haven't released much information about how the mitigations work at all. But a few years ago, like 3 years ago, maybe two, I don't remember. I think it was a Blue Hat conference that Microsoft put on. Somebody from Microsoft actually came out and did a presentation on the mitigations that are associated with Init, which is now Exploit Guard, and went into some pretty decent detail. And there was a paper, and it does give you a lot more detail than in the past, but it still doesn't get into the weeds. Like, it doesn't really explain how the mitigation actually works. And some of these mitigations, as a developer, you have to understand how the mitigation works so that you can potentially opt in or opt out at a per thread level. So some mitigations, the developer actually has to go and tie directly in with the company's policy around which mitigations are going to turn on. The great thing about it is it's very granular now, where you've got the ability to target specific applications, and you can also turn on mitigations per application level, as well as choose the option which is just logging. We could say don't actually block, just log it. And that's more like an intrusion detection style versus prevention, which is a great way to do that, trying not to get fired from doing screen testing. So what I want to do in this webcast series, and what we've have been doing in the past, is get into the weeds, understand at a very low level how this thing works, and that requires debugging and reverse engineering. If you saw one of my streams a couple months back, I specifically looked at the mitigation do not allow child processes, also known as the calculator killer. That is a mitigation that says if someone's able to gain code execution of a process and their payload is to actually create a new child process or fork, whatever, uh, this mitigation would block that. So it makes it so an application or process is not allowed to spawn a child process by blocking the ability to call create process. And I had assumed going into that stream, exploit guard mitigations are userland controls. It's done via hooking. And I've demoed that before in the past as well. I think we looked at stack pivot protection, and I made a educated guess and said what I think it's probably going to do is it's going to hook the imports table, or it's going to modify the very first instruction inside a function that we want to call, and it's going to jump us to a different location. And where it takes us to is actually a spot inside the DLL payload restrictions.dll, which is actually doing the actual checks. So just if my connection does start to go in and out, please do let me know, because I can do some things like I can cut the camera and maybe that'll save on some bandwidth. So just periodically, if you let me know if things are going okay or poorly, that would be helpful for me. I see some questions coming in. I'm going to address those in a second. Let me just finish my thoughts here, though, which is some of them are done via hooking in user land, and that's fine. The stack pivot protection, which was originally called anti-ROP, is a very basic mitigation. All we found out that it does is the thread information block, the stack base and the stack limit, to validate that the stack pointer is within the range of the stack for that thread, else it terminates the process and throws an exception, which is a simple mitigation. It's just making sure that no one's stolen the stack pointer away. That's super easy userland mitigation. But as I started to say, when we looked at do not allow child processes, I thought that that was another userland mitigation. And it turns out that it wasn't. It was actually enforced by the kernel. So we had to open up our kernel debugger, and we ended up identifying some kind of flags field. It was like a mitigation flags field inside a structure. I think it was inside of eProcess structure. Might have been under kthread, but it was inside a structure in the kernel per process, and there are mitigation flags in there. And there's actually two fields of mitigation flags, and there was a function that actually goes and checks a bit inside the mitigation flags field to see if a specific bit is turned on or off. So I remember I had Jonathan Ryder on. Yeah, it's okay to follow. Good. Hopefully it'll stay pretty solid for everybody. The code's a little bird. Yeah, I'm not zooming in yet. Don't worry about that. I'll zoom in when appropriate and stuff. Um, Mitigation flags were there's also a function that actually sets that mitigation to begin with. So we learned a lot, and I actually ended up having Jonathan Ryder on, who's a friend of mine, coworker of mine, and we looked into how to document undocumented native structures because all of those flags, there's a bunch of them, and they were not documented most for the most part. We ended up having to look in some header file, and we found some of the mitigation flags, but not all of them. So we went in and documented the additional flags in there, which was a nice stream that was documenting undocumented structures. But that was an example of a kernel enforced mitigation. Now it's pretty simple. It's just a little flag that gets set that specifies whether or not you're allowed to uh, spawn a child process or not, but it was still kernel enforced. I'm actually talking to Connor McGar again, specifically about doing a stream on a more advanced kernel mitigation, specifically something associated with VBS, which is virtualization based security, something like HVCI, which is a pretty nasty control, one of the stronger mitigations that really is making it painful for code execution in ring 0 because it's playing with ring -1, of course, at the hypervisor. So I'm going to turn my camera off for a little bit, and hopefully that will help a little bit of the lagging that happens. So let me stop my camera. I don't know if it's better, because if it's not better, then I'll just turn the camera back on because it's not really making a difference. A couple of questions here. Let's see. Is it feasible for Lone Wolf to find and exploit zero-day vulnerability on top-tier software? Um, so there are still a ton of one-offs out there. If you follow people like Alex Ionescu and some other folks, Yarden, Shafir, and all, like there's a lot of techniques that have been mitigated. Some of them still work sometimes. For example, the previous mode field, which is a very well-known field that basically specifies whether or not when you're if a request came in from like the kernel or user land. Because if code execution is to occur, or if we're going to be reading and writing from different areas within virtual memory, we want to know whether or not that virtual memory is in kernel or user land. Because what we don't want is, as supervisor, as kernel, to be making changes into user land memory space and such, unless we really know what we're doing. So like you can toggle certain flags and potentially cause something to happen at a level that it shouldn't. And I remember when I on Microsoft like announced that next week in the preview version of Windows that was coming out, they were adding a protection. And Connor actually did a talk at Hackfest a couple months back in LA where it was called nickel and dime mitigations. And he was talking specifically about like why is Microsoft, for example, focus so much time on these little mitigations that really only go after a specific technique used by attackers. Well, I mean, it makes sense. If you look at like a global technique that a lot of us use is token stealing. And we used to do token stealing primarily by having code execution in ring 0. But with the mitigations, it's really hard to get code execution in ring 0. There's a lot of code signing and other enforcements there. So you can actually steal the token of process 4, which is system, just through read write primitives, which is fantastic. So if Microsoft really wanted to hurt the attack techniques that we use, like obviously going and breaking the ability to steal the system token somehow would stop a lot of the exploits. So that's kind of what they're focusing on. Like when they know that attackers are using the previous mode field and abusing it, they're going to focus time adding a mitigation that tries to stop that from being possible. And there are so many mitigations now, it's almost like overwhelming. Someone just asked me the other day, like, why do I think that there's so many mitigations that are so advanced and effective on binary exploitation, but not associated with web apps? Like all these web app vulnerabilities that have been out for decades, like SQL injection and blind SQL injection and cross-site scripting and SSRF, all that stuff. Why aren't they applying the same level of mitigation time and focus on those types of vulnerabilities? And there's different answers to that question. I'm not really going to go into that right now, but the point is that yes, on the binary exploitation side, it is overwhelming. And that question comes up a lot, which is, do we think that we'll still be able to do that, these types of attacks? And like, there's always going to be one-off attacks. It's just like the repeatable techniques don't work as often. Okay, let me go back up here real quick. No difference with the camera on or off. Does that mean it's still, is it still lagging a bit every once in a while? I'll turn the camera back on, but you just let me know if it's still lagging a bit, just in general, or if I hit on a few other of these questions. We got to get moving here pretty soon, or we're not going to get through what I want to show, which is the fun stuff. Looking at the questions here. Let's see. Conor McGraw, if you can go find that, if you're in the background, just Google Conor McGraw HVCI, the exploit mitigation. There should be an article, and if anybody else finds it first, you can. Man, I don't know why I cut out every once in a while. Well, hopefully it's not something that's too painful. All right. Okay. Okay. So hopefully it's not too bad, and we will keep going here. I don't want to mess around with my settings. I could mess around with my. I have two internet connections. I could try to fail over to the other one again, but then sometimes that just makes things worse. Cool. Thanks. Okay, great. Okay, cool. All right, I'm going to stop focusing and worrying about that, and I'm going to get started on this stream, the focus area. You can see, though, just at the beginning there, we just start talking about things, and like time goes flying by. We're already like 15 minutes from when I started. So let's dive in, focus, and I'm going to use Zoom. I'm using an old Windows 7 system as the host on this stream, and then the Windows 10 and 11 systems we're looking at on the VM. So we're looking at Windows modern systems. The host is just an old system because the magnifier works really well on it. And I've noticed if you use a magnifier, and it's still a problem with me anyway, like hang IDA and the other problems start to manifest, and I just don't want to deal with it. So I will use the magnifier so we can zoom in and see the code that we care to see. All I've got up on the screen right now, though, is, and let me bring up the magnifier real quick. Old one. All right, so all I've got up on the screen here, this is old, not old, but this is like bad code. It's a little tiny program that I wrote that basically is what I used when we looked at the do not allow child processes mitigation. And I just wrote a program that basically calls create process, and it wants you to give it an argument, which is the process you want it to spawn. And that's how we were able to debug that and go into kernel mode and all that. But so just because I'm lazy, I pulled up that same old program and I set the argument vector to where if we don't give an argument, then it defaults over to calling virtual alloc ex. So that's basically what we're starting with. I'm also going to add in here, just because I just thought of it, virtual protect, because virtual protect is another a sensitive API. So basically, what we're trying to do is force exploit guard to trigger one of these mitigation checks by intentionally defined by Microsoft as being able to do things like modify permissions in memory or do allocations in memory. Things like write process memory is another critical function that basically ignores all the permissions and lets you write anywhere you want, even if it's an executable page. Like, so these are critical functions that allow you to change permissions in memory, and that's why they're the ones that are typically monitored by these mitigation toolkits. An example of a mitigation toolkit that's not Microsoft would be Malwarebytes. Has a product called Anti-Exploit. Effectively does the same types of things that Microsoft does, but from a non-Microsoft supplier. And you can't have both running at the same time. They fight each other over that turf. It's kind of like having two intrusion prevention products running at the same time. It's just not going to work real well. So what I'm going to do is simply add virtual protect there. And let me see. So don't worry about it being blurry or anything. It's not something that you need to see so much. I'm just going to go ahead and add something else in. So we're going to say, let's do virtual protect. And then we're just going to call that. Now, the nice thing about obviously Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio in general, it shows you the arguments. So the first thing it wants is the address of where we want to change permissions. The next thing is a size. The next thing is the new protection flags or option, which we're going to set it to the initial page that we allocated with virtual alloc is read, write, execute. So I'm going to intentionally change that to just read, write. I think we'll get there in a second, because I don't know if we compile it and we don't actually call virtual protect to change the permissions. It might just like not even compile virtual protect into the program because it's like you're not doing anything that's useful. So we're going to optimize and kick that thing out. So I'm going to make sure we change those mitigations. And then the last, I'm sorry, the permissions. And then the last argument it wants is the LPFL old protect. Basically, it wants you to give it an address so it can write the old permissions option. And the reason you do that is so that if you want to switch it back, like good practice, if you need to do this in the first place, but you typically should not need to do this, if you need to change permissions on a page of memory and make it temporarily executable or something crazy like that, you probably want to go back and change the permissions back to the safer option. So the first thing I'm going to do before we call it, we'll call it FL old protect. So we'll say D word FL old protect, and we're just going to set that to being equal to 0. And that's going to be the location in memory where I'm going to store the old protect value with the call to virtual protect. So virtual protect. And then, all right, first thing it wants here is our address. So I'm going to go ahead and use our page that our variable earlier. So P page, the one that's basically being created with our call for virtual alloc. And then our size was 256 on that one. So I'm going to leave it as 256 because that's the same size. And then we're going to change it to page. And then here we're going to say, I'm going to change it from execute write to just execute read. So it won't be able to write there. So we'll do underscore execute. And then read. That should be good for that one. And then our final one is going to be basically the address of our variable where we're going to write the old permission value. So FL old protect. All right, so that should be fine. So let me just check the comments real quick here. Cool. All right, so that should be fine. And then I'm going to go ahead and save this. And before we actually start debugging this thing, we're going to look in IDA Pro in a second here. I just want to have these 2 calls to critical functions. And let me go over to Command Shell. All right, so where is this thing located? This is in my user's student create process. Okay, so CL, let's leave all default mitigations, users, student, and then it should be at that location. And we'll just let it write to my documents. Let's just see if it compiles anyway, because I haven't tried to compile this thing in a while. All right, it compiled. Got a couple warnings, but I just don't care because this is not some real application. So we've compiled that, and we should be good to go. It should be inside my my documents folder. So let me go and make sure it's there real quick. All right, create process. It is cool. So it just got created right now. So we've got our binary. That should be good to go. Let me, before we mess with that, though, go over to IDA Pro, and I'll zoom in here in a second. Don't worry. Nothing exciting to see so far. All right, so right now we're inside payload restrictions.dll. And the reason we care about that one is because that is the DLL for user land to apply these mitigations. So if you don't turn on exploit guard, payload restrictions.dll will not be loaded into the process. Some strange behavior, which we're probably going to see it today, which this is the kind of stuff that bothers me and scares me a bit, is sometimes when you turn on a mitigation, it's supposed to load the DLL and apply the mitigations, the ones that you selected anyway, but it doesn't. It just doesn't do it. And then I found that if you go and turn on a couple mitigations, which have no dependency on each other, then it loads it and then it applies the mitigation. So my point is sometimes if you cherry pick the mitigations and only select like one or two, it doesn't load the DLL and doesn't apply the mitigations, which is weird behavior. And I haven't gotten an answer as to why that's the case. So we're going to see if that's the case here momentarily. But first, the mitigation we want to look at is export address table filtering. Let's look inside first off. We're in the system settings. I'm going to go over to program settings. We're going to need to add the program we just compiled because it's not going to be put there by default. By default, Windows automatically puts the majority of things installed in program files, but especially stuff like browsers and word processing apps and email clients, stuff like that, Adobe. So we're going to say add program. We'll do it by exact path in this example. And it should pop up here and ask me what. So documents, create process. Cool, it's right there. So we're going to start that guy up. And now you can see we have a new entry. And this, I'll zoom in. This is our mitigations per process. So you can see we're specifically looking at create process.exe. And these are all those mitigations. Arbitrary code guard. I mean, there's 20 or more. So I'm not going to really spend much time talking about each one of these. I've done a presentation in the past where we've walked through at a high level all these mitigations, and I'm not going to do that again right now. There's the one we looked at before. Do not allow child processes. If you look at the history in the off by one channel, you'll see that we actually did that one already, and that one's enforced by the kernel. So export address table filtering. This is the one we're going to look at today. Detects dangerous exported functions being resolved by code. So again, being resolved by malicious code. So what does that mean? That means exported functions are something that DLLs do, right? They have an export address table where the functions are exported, and we can load that library and we can get the proc address and we can use it. This is saying specifically resolved by malicious code. So our question is, how is it determining if a function from an exports table is being accessed by malicious code or good code? How does it do that, and what is it doing? That's the question we have. Now, I remember on Emmet, the whole Enhanced Mitigation Experience Toolkit, it had EAF and then EAF Plus. There were two different versions of it. And I think EAF, if I remember correctly, by itself only protected critical DLLs, meaning kernel 32, and NTDLL, and some other ones. And then their EAF Plus, if I remember correctly, actually allowed you to specify a list of modules that you also want to protect. Like you could basically say, I don't want this particular module to ever be able to access the exports table of one of these critical DLLs. Something like Flash would be a good example from the past. We would abuse Flash all the time. And one of the things you can size of a sound vector or something that you spray the heap with using ActionScript, you could actually parse through. Flash would have access to all userland memory. And since Flash has access to userland memory, it could then go and start hunting for and trying to resolve functions from inside kernel 32. Another important thing to say, the way that Windows shellcode typically works still to this day is that we dereference the PEB from inside the thread information block. So inside the TIB, 32 and 64-bit, there is a offset 30 on 32-bit and 60 on 64-bit. That's where the PEB pointer is stored. So shellcode, it needs to know on Windows where kernel 32 is loaded so that it can then walk the exports table of kernel 32 to get the function get proc address. Because once you resolve the location of get proc address, you can pass it the argument load library, And now you've got the address of load library and the address of get proc address. You've got the power to load any DLL you want and resolve any address you want. So that is what Windows shellcode is doing. This mitigation export address table filtering is specifically targeting that. It wants to know if the exports table of critical DLLs is being accessed by malicious code, aka shellcode. So think about that. If that is the way the shellcode works on Windows, dereference FS offset 30 or GS offset 60, get the PEB pointer, identify the third listed module, which is kernel 32. You got the load address. Go to the offset where the exports table is located. Start going through a little loop and trying to find out where get proc address is by comparing a little hash. Once you find it, you're good. So this mitigation from being possible somehow. And that's why it's interesting to me, because that's kind of cool that the mitigation is doing that. Like this is a mitigation that specifically tries to break your shellcode on Windows. So pretty neat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it on. And I think that this option here, validate access for modules that are commonly abused, I think that that's the old EAF plus. I don't really care about that right now. I'm just going to leave it as this. What I'm expecting is that when we save this now, I'm going to jump out of full screen, zoom in, and we apply this. I'm expecting now when I start the process that it is going to load payload restrictions. Video keeps freezing every 2 minutes or so. It's causing the issue. I'm not sure how to stop that, but is it when it hangs? Is it really short? Does it come back pretty quickly? So what I can do hopefully in the future is redo this as not a live stream and put the video up having recorded it like offline, and that way it'll be a better quality one. But I've asked people many times, like, do you prefer this as a stream like I've been doing it, or would you rather it be like videos that are edited and posted? There's obviously pros and cons to both, and most people say no, we like the live stream because we're kind of doing this together, and like we run into bumps in the road and we got to resolve the issues. Like 2 seconds. Okay. Short freeze. All right. Well, let's hope that it keeps going. Randa, if you're texting me, it's kind of hard for me to read the text while I'm streaming here. Um, yeah, you're missing someone. I'm saying I just don't know what to do to resolve that. If I say anything that's critical and you miss it, I guess let me know. Occasional drops. Okay, let me know if you miss something critical, and I can repeat it. So we've now turned on the mitigation supposedly. So we're going to go to Win debug, and we are going to see if that actually happened or not. So let me kill this real quick. Start with a fresh copy of WinDebug, another system. We don't need that for now, though. Let me just turn on a fresh copy of WinDebug. Yeah, exactly. Thanks. All right, so we're bringing WinDebug back up, or WinBag, or whatever you want to call it. And eventually, I'll be able to do what I want to do. So we are going to go ahead and start up that process. And create process. Here we go. So I'm launching the executable inside the debugger, and we're going to zoom in here in a second. Okay, so that's good. Right there, payload restrictions.dll did load, and I only turned on the one mitigation. So that anomaly behavior that I mentioned before didn't happen this time. So it looks like that's okay. And in fact, what I'm going to do real quick to verify this is I'm going to go over to exploit guard, and I'm just going to turn the mitigation off real quickly to see if it removes it and then puts it back in again. I just want to make sure that we're not debugging something that's not working properly. So let's turn that back off. Any moment. All right, and then let me go ahead and go back to WinDebug, and we'll restart this process. It should be gone now. All right, so it's starting back up. painfully slow. And right now you can see that there is no payload restrictions.dll. So it did take it out. So good. Now, if I go back over here one more time and we turn it back on again, we just want to make sure it gets loaded back in. All right, turning it back on. And we're just going to validate that it is back inside the debugger. All right, so again, it's going painfully slow for some reason, but that's WinDebug sometimes. All right, so DLL. So we're good to go. That's all I wanted to verify. It looks like it's working. Great. That's the only mitigation that we're going to be dealing with. That means nothing else will get in our way, because sometimes you can get distracted by the multiple mitigations going on. All right, so before we start diving in the debug session, let's go over to IDA. Right now I've got IDA. I just loaded payload restrictions.dll. And what we want to do, I'll zoom in here, is look at the functions name area over here. And we're looking for the mitigation functions. There they are. So you can see, you know that you found them because they're called mitlib is the prefix, which stands for mitigation library. So we've got a bunch here, and now we're looking specifically for export address table filtering. So what we could do is start walking through and try to identify anything via its name that has EAF in it or something that looks interesting. So if we scroll down here, I'm just reading through, like right here, you see initialize IAF shadow. So import address table shadow page, it's probably talking about basically to watch the import address table, because that's another mitigation, is where people will go in and hook the imports table. And that's what a lot of antivirus and stuff does, because you get a first chance to do something and inspect what's happening before you allow it to continue what it's trying to do. So you'll see a lot with exploit guard is you'll hook the imports table, or more often you don't hook the actual table, you let it go to the function that it wants to go to, but the very first instruction has been modified to a jump that then gets payload restrictions.dll, the ability to then go in and well, no. Here's another one, protect module IAF guard page. So here's one, mitlib add EAF plus. So that's export address table filtering plus, which we talked about the difference between regular and plus. So here's a bunch of them. Add default plus config EAF plus modules. So parsing the modules is going to be interesting. I bet if we double click here, let me zoom out. If we double click here, we're at this function called mitlib parse EAF plus modules. And if we scroll down a little bit, we're just looking for a name that looks interesting. So if we scroll down here, haven't seen anything good yet. So here's a call to mitlib add EAF plus config entry. So I'm just hoping to see that there is actually a some variable that is pretty obvious, the actual mitigation modules themselves, because it should be a list. Let's check out that other function call real quick. And inside here, more of the same. Anything interesting? So I'm not seeing any obvious names here like I was hoping to see, which is fine. So I'm going to go back over parse EAF plus modules, EAF config entry plus modules, add default. So let's check that add default one. That might be more interesting. There's a call to config entry again. I'm assuming though that there is going to be a little variable in a data section, like right here, gmitlib EAF plus modules default. If we double click this guy, and there they are. So perfect. That's what I was expecting to see. These right here are the ones, those are the modules protected by EAF plus. Up here at the top, those are the default ones. Actually, I'm really glad that we found this because that makes it real simple to see. These are the default modules that are protected. Kernel 32, kernel base, and NTDLL. As I mentioned, kernel 32 is the one that shellcode typically goes after. Now, there are other ways to resolve the base address of kernel 32, but specifically kernel 32 has get proc address and some of these other functions that you want. Now, they can move around sometimes, but it's always easy to find the base address of these modules because they're at static offsets from within inside the process environment block. And then down here below, we can see all these other DLLs that look scary, right? JScript.dll, Flash.ocx, MSHTML. I mean, that was every use after free and type confusion vulnerability, right? There's a lot of just scary DLLs that are protected by default with EAF plus. Okay, cool. So we see the default modules now that are going to be protected, and that's something we wanted to see. Oops, get my email out of there. Sorry with that. So supposed to actually like turn that stuff off before you get started. So what do we know so far? Not much. We know that there are some functions in there that turn on either the default EAF with the default modules of kernel 32, kernel base, and NTDLL, and then there's the EAF plus option, which has a bunch of other default modules that you can protect. Now, the old version edit, you could define a list specifically. I don't think we have that option here. I don't think we can go in and add additional modules to protect like we could with Emmet, but that's fine. These are the most critical modules anyway. So we see the critical functions there. We saw the DLLs. Now we haven't seen the critical functions yet, actually. Let's find those. So let's go back over to the functions list and look for something else interesting. So mitlib activate protections, protect our modules. Okay, so protect our modules. That could be a reference to the DLLs. That could be something that gets called. Let's look at that later if we need to. If we keep going down though, there we go. Hooked APIs, initialize hooked APIs. So what I'm hoping is that or resolve hooked APIs in module. I'm hoping that there is going to be a reference to another data segment list of critical functions. What I want to find now are the critical functions. So let's double click on that guy. And let me zoom in. It's a pretty small function, but we're looking for something that sticks out. Another reference to some variable that looks interesting, right? So here we see a reference to NTDLL, which is not that interesting, but a little bit interesting. Hook entry point, call mitlib hook APIs in module. Let's just check that one out real quick. Again, just trying to do it the easy way before we get into anything complicated. I'm looking for some reference to a variable that is going to give us the hooked modules. Angle add function. It's easy to miss stuff too, especially like when you're under the pressure of streaming and you're trying to find stuff quickly, so we're not wasting a ton of time. So mitlib random scene. Let's go back over here. Hook APIs. Give me a moment. Hook APIs. Again, looking for a reference. There's other ways we can do this too, and we can try and cheat, look for string searches and such, but there should be something that sticks out pretty easily here. Hook entry point. Hooks dispatcher. This guy doesn't look interesting, does it? No, let's go back on this one. I might have to cheat here in a section, but before we do that, let me check out this reference to NTDLL here. So when we get down here, you can see again DLLs like kernel base .dll, payload restrictions. Scrolling down. Oh, that looks interesting right here. So we've got load library A WEXA. So the whole load library suite of functions or family of functions. Load or load DLL. It's another way to load DLLs. Virtual alloc EX, protect virtual memory, virtual protect, heap create. These are all the critical functions. It's exactly what I was looking for, but I was hoping to find it a different way. But these are all the critical functions that I mentioned before. So when you think about return-oriented programming, we typically set up a call to these types of functions so that we can change permissions in memory to get around dep. Like one of the most common things you do with ROP or JOP is to get around dep. And the way you do that is by calling these critical functions. Now, these are the functions that are going to be protected by exploit guard, because the way exploit guard works, at least some of the time, is again, it hooks, and before it lets you actually call a critical function like virtual alloc, it inspects it. It inspects it for what? Well, the one example we talked about was stack pivot protection. When we saw that one, it inspects the stack pointer and validates that the stack pointer is pointing in a proper range within the stack limits for that thread. And that's specifically what it's looking at. So again, these are all the critical APIs. These are the protected ones. So if we scroll up a little bit, I'm hoping to see some reference to a name that looks more interesting here, because I don't like the way I found this. That's not the way I wanted to do it. I mean, it works, which is fine, but yeah, they're all aligned next to each other. So pretty neat. All right, let's zoom out here for a moment and let's go back. So I'm going to check the comments real quick. Want to make sure I don't miss anything. Switch to decompiler? Yeah, absolutely. We can look at the decompiler. Sorry. I don't want to get too distracted by comments because we're going to, again, there's a lot to cover here. I don't want to lose track of thought. But again, I've got the Hexraise decompiler in here, and that's absolutely a more efficient way to look at things depending on what it is that you're looking for. That specifically, though, I was simply looking for a reference to a variable that's got to be called something like hooked APIs, just something simple like that. So it wasn't going to really help us to jump up here. Plus, there's always a lot of cleaning up we got to do there as well. Let me drop out here. Let's go back over one more time. Hooked APIs, resolved hooked APIs in module. Oh, and now I found it. So of course I found it after we already figured out a different way. So if I go up here, right there, mit-lib hook module table. So the hook table, that's the variables I was looking for. And there's probably another one specifically for the just the API list itself. But if we click on this hook table, right there, it shows us, kind of what we saw before. So there's going to be multiple hook tables. All right. Yeah, we saw Rust. Rust got into the kernel a little bit with win32k.sys driver, but I haven't seen much more than that yet. So we saw the hook table. So let's go ahead and debug this a little bit and see what happens. So we've got the mitigation on. Let's go into the debugger and let's let this run. So right now, all we've done is load the program, create process. So if we run it, I'm going to hit G, we run it. And sadly, nothing is happening. So there's a sleep call in there, which is fine, but I was hoping that we would hit something with EAF plus before we actually get started. So what's supposed to happen, or what I'm hoping would happen, is that EAF plus is going to catch us pretty quickly, because this program calls virtual alloc and it calls virtual protect. So right now you can see it paused automatically. Let's tell it to continue, and it just stopped. So basically it ran the sleep command, and then it didn't actually cause it to break, even though we called those critical functions. It should have paused. Something should have happened. mitigation is working. So we'll restart it. Let's make sure that payload restrictions is loaded. And it is. So we'll say go. So it's not doing what I would like it to do. Now, this might be going back to the anomaly that I mentioned before. What we're going to do now is go over to exploit guard, and we're going to go ahead and turn on a couple more mitigations. Because again, I've noticed that if you don't have a couple on, a lot of times the mitigations don't actually take effect. So this may or may not be the case with this example. All right, so let's turn that one on and then go down, and we're going to turn on stack pivot protection as well. So we've got 3 mitigations on now, but those mitigations shouldn't actually cause anything to happen because we're not violating anything. Hey there. So as you saw, the thing dropped. I'm hoping it stays up a bit better. I'm gonna have to definitely sorry, Victoria, if you're still there. I'm definitely gonna have to re-record this one so it's just cleaner. I'm gonna keep going anyway, and hopefully it'll stay up here. But if you want to bear with me here, let's keep going. So basically, what I was saying is we hit the guard page, and the reason we know that this is EAF is because it's get proc address that's being called right now. Get proc address is that function that works by accessing the exports table of the function of the API or function you want to resolve. So you would pass get proc address a function name. It goes to the exports table of the associated DLL and it resolves it for you. So that's how we get that. So a guard page is going to work by changing permissions or setting a debug register, some way of enforcing a guard page to make it so that page of memory is protected. And if something goes to access that page with whatever primitive you do it with, it's gonna trap that. It's gonna throw an exception. So that's what we're seeing happen. And so a couple things to point out here that are going to be interesting. One is going to be that you've got the address right there. This would be called, we would call this one the instruction pointer value that is triggering the fault. So that's going to be an important address with a protection like this. So there's probably going to be some recording of this address and probably a table like the process control block type table, your context table, so that we can then do some validation as we go in and see what happens. Now, we haven't gone in very deep yet. We're about to, but we're just trying to pick apart the pieces that are happening right now. So the address of the page of memory where that's guarded is going to be this one here. So this address right there is the guarded page. And we can see what we're trying to do is we're going to dereference some offset within the guarded page of memory into register 11. That is throwing an exception because, again, it's a guarded page. Specifically, get proc address was called to access this guarded page. Now, what we're going to do next is validate what is that guarded page and why is it being guarded? At least that's the next question I have. Let's make sure we're still up here. Great. So in order to do that, we are going to, from inside the debug session, we're going to grab that address of the guarded memory and get some more information about it. So we're just going to say bang address and paste that in. And I'll zoom in when appropriate. Like right here, you can see that it's kernel32.dll. So something inside kernel32.dll is protected with this guard page. So we've got the actual address, and now we've got the base address. So here's the base address. I want to subtract the base address from the guard page address. So to do that, we can just ask WinDebug real quickly. So we'll say question mark. Actually, I'll bring that address up here. And then we'll say question mark. And then we're going to subtract that. And what we get here is 8EC98. So AEC98 is the offset. That's a relative offset from inside kernel32 that's guarded. So we want to know what's there. So we can use the DH command. So bang, DH, and we're going to give it the module. This should be enough. I might use a flag here in a second. Let me use the -F flag. Hold on here. There we go. So these are the offsets of the different sections, the directories inside kernel32. Now look at that offset again. That offset is 8EC98. AEC80 is where the export table starts. So see what we just learned there? That's pretty interesting, right? We're validating now, or we validated that the protected page is the export directory of kernel32. That makes sense. So get proc address is trying to access the exports table of kernel 32, and we just validated that, and that's a guarded page. Okay, so that makes sense. We know that this is behavior of EAF. Now the question is, if that's a protected page of memory, if kernel 32 exports table is protected, it does need to be accessible by legitimate functionality, right? Like it needs to be something where we can go and resolve the addresses from inside these DLLs, or else it's going to break the application or the process. So legitimate callers need to be able to do it, but illegitimate callers need to not be able to do it. So how is it going to do that is the question. Now we know that it just threw an exception because we accessed a guarded page in kernel 32. So what I want to know then is what is this exception, like who's handling this exception? First off, let's look at the call stack right now. Nothing interesting there. You can see it's just a normal call chain for get proc address. So nothing interesting there. What I want to do then is we saw that we hit a single step exception as well immediately afterward. So I think what we want to do is start looking for an exception handler potentially inside of payload restrictions.dll. I'm just thinking out loud to see if there's anything else where it makes sense for us to do. Now let's just go and look. Let's go back over to IDA. Let's take a look at this. I'm assuming here that this is EAF forcing a guard page that's getting hit, in this case, by a legitimate caller, because I'm the one calling virtual protect and virtual Alex. So everything that's happening is normal. It's supposed to happen. So then what I want to do is check IDA to see if there is a way to find out if there's an exception handler here. Now, I'm just thinking out loud again. We could search for kind of that messaging that we're seeing to see if that's something that we can find, like the messaging of guard page, for example. Like it's specifically saying, if we go forward here, single step exception. And now we reach the end of it. So let me go ahead and restart the process. All right, now we're going to hit that first exception. So guard page violation. So we could search for guard page violation via a text search inside IDA. In fact, let's try that as a lazy way of doing it first, and then I'm just going to look to see if there's an exception handler in there. So we're going to go anywhere inside. I'm just going to hit Alt-T for text search. And again, we're looking for guard page violation. So that's going to take a moment to run. And after this, depending on what result we get, we're going to go and look for exception handlers, specifically being inside of here, inside of payload restrictions.dll. So it should be done any second now. It's not that big of a DLL. It's only got 734 functions. And we got no results. Okay, fine. I was hoping for some way to cheat there. Let's go over to the functions window, and let's look for an exception handler in here. Report filter violation. I'm sure we can find it if we also go in and look at the export address table filtering functions here. There's got to be a way to find a handler. The handler's also got to be registered as well. So we can look it up via the registration, how handlers get registered when you put them inside a DLL to begin with. So let's look one more parse through real quick. Query mitigations, protected page, DLL events, protect our modules, get proc address called. That's interesting. Notify get proc address called. And let's just go and look specifically at export address table functions right now. So process initialize EAF plus. All right, so let's zoom out. And let's just use this manual zoom here. Mitlib add EAF plus modules. And if we don't find it quickly for this route, we're going to go ahead and look for, I'm going to check my notes and see if somebody said something here. We could look for exception code in IDA. Yeah, absolutely. So let me go back over here real quick. I'm just looking at the cross references to these functions to see if anything sticks out. So one thing you always want to do as well in IDA, do view, subviews, and then go down to function calls, because a lot of times you can quickly find things of interest down here. Like here you can see, I'll zoom in, all these calls to these different functions associated with mitigations. Like we see a lot for IAF shadow, dispatch, I call for pointer K, procedure address. All right, zoom out of here. All right. One last check here, and then I'm going to do it the way by looking up the registration of an exception handler. If anybody sees anything I'm missing, please do call it out. I'll eventually see it. Oh, there we go. So handle single step exception, mitlib exception handler. Okay, well, that works fine too. But the problem is if we didn't have the symbols, so here's one thing, I think somebody mentioned this as well. Microsoft provides us with the majority of symbols that we need to be able to debug Windows applications. And they don't do that to be nice. They do it because in order to be able to write Windows applications that run on the Windows operating system, you need the ability to debug, know what you're debugging. So they give you the symbols of the things you need. They don't give you symbols for like native functionality or things like Microsoft Office Suite. They're typically not just going to hand over the symbol files, the PDB files for Microsoft Office Suite, unless you are a developer of extensions or plugins for Office Suite and you need them. So this is very generous of Microsoft to give this to us. And this was an easy way for us to find the exception handler. If this wasn't the option, we would have had to go and look at how exception handlers are registered inside the DLL and find it that way. It's going to be via some imports. So I'm going to double click on the exception handler here. Let me zoom out and zoom in this way. All right, so mitlib exception handler. Here we get validate access to protected page and single step exception. That kind of lines up though with the two events that we saw. Remember, we saw the first event was page protected page was hit, and then the other one was a single step mention. So this looks like the handler code specifically for those two conditions. And depending on which of those two conditions, we got one and then we got the other immediately following each other, you're going to go to these different functions here. That's interesting. Let's look at the cross references first before we dive in on that one, because this is going to be useful. Mitlib activate protection. So if we double click on this guy, here is where we load that handler into RDX, and then we call add vectored exception handler. That's the way I would have gone in a moment if we didn't find the handler the other way and looked at that import to find the handlers that way, because that's the probably smarter way of doing it. So, okay, we've got this function here. It protect VM. It does some things. Let's look at the functions window. So it doesn't do too much, but it does register the handler there that we care about. So let's go back to the handler because that's not very interesting. And we've got these two functions we're going to call. Mitlib validate access to protected page. Let's go back over to WinDebug, and we can see it says guard page violation. And we could probably single step through here and see where we end up. I'm going to do T a few times, and we're just going to see where we go. get proc address. Let me get out. Resolve procedure address. Get out. Okay, so I think we're too late at this point is the problem, and it already executed that code. So if we go back over here, let's go into this function. This is probably the first one that's called. Since the other one's better named, handle single step exception, which we see happens immediately after the first exception, we can assume and infer that this is the first one we go to right here. So we're now in a function called mitigation library validate access to protected page. So quite a long function name. And this one's a decent sized function. If you look at the whole thing, it's not huge, but it's not tiny. So let's zoom back in. And let's look at the function calls from here. We see function calls to reader gadget check. That's interesting. Process EAF guard page. So we talked before about import address filtering and how that's going to also be something that uses guard page. It's going to set a guard page on the import address table. We're looking at the export address table mitigation, but you can see it also uses guard pages to protect the import one if you turn that mitigation on, but that's not the one we're looking at right now. Mem reader gadget check. I don't know what that is. I'm curious. Let's just double check that. Click that real quick. Mem reader gadget check. What is this thing? Oh, interesting. So look what it's doing here. It says we're calling this function disassemble x86. And if we go down further, you see references to operands instructions. My guess, without knowing what this is probably the mitigation for the caller. I'm guessing the caller exploit mitigation, which is a mitigation that only works on 32-bit. I don't think it runs on 64-bit processes on Windows, but it basically checks to make sure that when you call a function, that you reach that function via the proper instruction. Like when we do return-oriented programming, we typically return to virtual protect because we're doing ROP, right? And that's not the normal way you call a function. We don't return to a function start address. So this might be the caller mitigation that validates that how a function was called is via the proper call instruction. Because when we do return-oriented programming, we typically don't call. I'm guessing that we could look at that one another time. But that's not the one we care about right now. Let's go back. So we want to get to the top of this function. We're at this function called, again, validate access to protected page. This is the handler that calls this. Validate access to protected page. We know that the protected page that we're talking about is right now kernel 32's export address table. So we've learned some stuff at this point, which is useful. So I'm going to check the comments real quick to see if anybody said anything. Cool. Okay. So okay. So next steps. What do we know? I just said what we knew. Now, what I want to do is start understanding what it's doing now. So two things are happening. We're calling this guard page violation and calling this function that we haven't reversed yet. And then right after that, if we go and we run that other exception. So before we dive into this one, because this is a pretty big one, let's look at the other handler here. Handle single step exception. This is a pretty small function, so it's going to be a little easier. Does it do anything interesting? Call REX. No, it's not going to be helpful. Okay, move GS30 into RDX. So we're grabbing the TIB most likely. Anything interesting here? I don't see anything exciting here. Well, but let's go back to this. I started to talk about the trap flag, and the trap flag is something that gets set when you're doing single step debugging. So this, if we go back to WinDebug real quick, let's just double check that real fast. If we continue here after that first exception, we hit this guard page violation first, and then we run it again, and we hit single step exception. So we're hitting the same thing, and then we hit it, like when we continued, we hit it again. So in order for that to be happening, the trap flag's got to be getting set by something, because we're not setting it. The trap flag is a flag inside the eFlags register, In fact, let's start looking at that real quick, because I'm curious about this. Let's go over to a browser, and we're going to look at eFlags trap. Sorry, eFlags. I can't spell, but that's all right. I have no idea what is with my spelling. Jeez. I think it's the keyboard is messed up. Must be a language thing or something. All right, let's let that go. eFlags, trap flag. eFlags, individual bit flags. Okay. So these are the flags. 0's position, 2's position, 4's. So the trap flags at offset 8 inside the flags. So let me think about this. I'm sorry. This is kind of, it gets kind of geeky when you're going through this stuff. So I'm talking out loud, which is not what I would normally do if I wasn't being watched. But what I'm trying to think about is, how does the trap flag get set when you're doing single step debugging? It's got to be done via, because we're not in kernel mode. If we were in kernel mode, we could access the context registers in KPRCB in that massive structure and do it that way and directly affect the register itself that you see on the screen in the processor core, but that's not going to work because we're in user land. So in order to be able to set the trap flag, it must be some context record. Let's look at one other thing real quickly. That's going to be exception handling on Windows. I want to look at something real quick. Not sure what's wrong with this browser window. All right, let's try it again. So exception handling Windows. Specifically trying to figure something out that's making sense in my brain, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it makes sense elsewhere. Let's see here. So exception handler. Let's look specifically at dispatching, actually. So exception handling, dispatching, Windows. This might be more valuable. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. Okay, perfect. So the machine state of the thread in which the exception occurred is saved in a context structure. That's what I was looking for. So there's an exception record structure and a context structure. So this is, again, we're getting into now how exception handling works on Windows, because it's a little bit complicated how structured exception handling works, like under the hood. So when an exception occurs, we know that there's like a if you've ever exploited like pop red against the SEH chain and simple attack technique on old Windows boxes, like you knew that there was a special stack frame that's set up for the exception handler, and that there's a callback, and that callback points to the NSEH position on the thread stack. But here we're talking specifically about the context that gets preserved, because when an exception occurs, we need to know who the faulting instruction pointer is at that moment in time. So all the registers need to be saved into a context record, and that's what we're looking here at the structure. So let's click on the structure, and here is that structure right here. It's quite large. DWord 64 context flags. Let's look at the structure inside of WinDebug. It's going to be a little easier to read, I think. So we're looking for DT context. It should be. There we go. Perfect. So if we scroll up here, here's the very top of that structure, okay? So there's the top of the context structure. We see the offset context flags. There's a segment register, and there's eFlags. So eFlags is at offset 44 hex inside the context structure. eFlags is where the trap flag would be getting set. I think that this is how the trap. If we set the trap flag here, that's when a single step debugging is going to trigger, I think. So that means that this needs to be getting set somewhere. So we're going to be looking for the context structure. Let's look for anything with the reference to offset 44 within some structure, as well as the flags position. What was the flags position? Anyone remember? So offset 44, and then the flags position is for the trap flag is 8. See that? The trap flag is 8. So offset 44, offset 8. Let's go back over to IDA. Right now, where are we? Let's go back to that main handler. Let's go back to validate access to protected page. Something in here has to be setting the trap flag. I'm trying to think of the easiest way to be able to find that without going through every single line. Let's try to decompile it first. So I'm going to, if I find something here, I'll pull it up. It's just going to be easier for me to just kind of read in here. All right. So give me like 30 seconds at the most. Report filter violation. So RTPC to file header, that's an interesting function call. What it does is it takes the program counter, which is the RIP instruction pointer, of the faulting address. So the faulting address is the address where the exception occurred. We record that into a context structure, and then this is saying specifically go and get the actual file header information of that faulting address. So that's a way to resolve the base like address of what it is that is responsible for the fault. So that's what's happening there. If we go down lower, trigger fail fast, current tab, TLS slots. That might be it. Let's go back over to disassembly towards the bottom here. So here's the very bottom. Let's go up from here. Oh, there it is right there. Right there. See that sneaky little guy? That's the bit set instruction, and it's saying set the 8th bit, which is the trap flag bit inside the context structure. How do we know that's the context structure? Because right there, offset 44 hex, we know is the position of the E flags register inside the context structure, and offset 8 is the trap flag. So now we just found that. So if we wanted to, we could just rename this to something more, something useful. Let's just call it context here. So context plus 44, we know that this offset is actually going to be the offset to the E flags. So I'm going to, don't want to set a breakpoint there. No. So we're learning something though. What we just learned, I know it's kind of like not the most exciting thing in the world, but it's neat because we guessed that since we keep hitting that fault, something has to be set in the trap flag, because how else would we be getting a single step exception? So that's where it's setting the trap flag. I'm trying to think of why it's doing that. So it's doing that because it needs to continuously be able to guard that page. It's got to reset that guard, else the guard would get cleared. I think that's how it works. I think if we looked up on MSDN how guard pages work, I'm pretty sure that it clears that flag and it's no longer guarded. And what this exception handlers are doing, the first one's probably enforcing the mitigation, and this second one, part of it is resetting the trap flag and guard page. So that's neat because it has to continually enforce this protection, because at any point in the process lifetime, it could be getting accessed, right? The export stable. So, okay, that's how that works. We probably take better notes than this, but what I want to know now then is we need the faulting IP address. That might be something within the context structure as well. Let's go to the very top of this actually. And remember, we're inside the validate access to protected page. Now, what I want to know is who has the instruction pointer and who has the guard page. We need to find out. Oh, right there, you can see it renamed context for us too. So we know that that context is going to be referenced any time now, so we can look at offsets accordingly. So I think what's going to happen is when the exception occurs, it's got to record the faulting address. That always has to happen. And also it's going to record the address of the page where the guard violation is occurring. So let me look at the handler itself, go back here. And if we zoom in, right here, we are dereferencing RCX into RAX. I think that that's going to be either the address of the faulting instruction pointer or the address of the guard page. Let's set a breakpoint here and actually stop. All right, so I'm going to jump over and see if I miss any comments. Anybody bearing with me or hanging in there? Hopefully this is making some sense here. And I'm gonna re-record it so it's a lot smoother and clearer, because I think that'll be a better video. But this is helpful because if I do a second video, you're not going to get this. You're going to get, oh, this is where that is. And we just know that because of magic, right? So I'm going to set a breakpoint right here, and we are going to see if this is the faulting address. So we're looking for a breakpoint with mitlib exception handler plus offset A. Offset A. So mitlib exception handler offset A. So let's go back over to here and restart this. And before we continue, we're going to set that breakpoint. So I'll zoom in so you can see this real quick. So U payload restrictions bang mitlib exception. Is that what it's called? Yeah, that's it. So mitlib exception handler plus A. Let's see what that is. Plus A L1. Yep, that's exactly what we want. Okay, so we're going to set a breakpoint here because I'm hoping that what's being dereferenced from RCX ends up being a structure or something useful to us going forward, because we need to know how it's recording the faulting address and how it's tracking the guard page address. So I'm going to set a breakpoint on this location. So BP on that guy, and then we'll just say go. All right, so we hit the guard page violation. I'm wondering if we were supposed to hit that first. So hopefully this means we're now going to go into the exception handler and we're going to hit that breakpoint. Let's see what happens here. But first, we need to record this address. That'll still be on the screen so we can watch it. That's the faulting IP. So let's say go. We hit my breakpoint. Okay, perfect. So let's see what RCX has. So DD RCX L1, actually DQ. It is this guy, 4B0. What is that? So the faulting address is this guy. What is that address then? Okay, let's look at RIX right now. So info, so register RIX, RCX. No, I only wants one at a time. RIX has that right now. 301. Nothing interesting. So we single step. RIX now has that. Okay, so that's recorded. Oh, let's see what if it gives us more information about this. First off, what's there? So DQ that address. What was that faulting address again? If we go up. Oh, there it is. Look at that. Okay, so what's getting loaded into RAX, I think, is a pointer to some structure. Within that structure, at this offset right there, that is the faulting RIP. See that? It matches what, the address up here. So that's where the faulting IP is recorded. So we're going to want to track that. So I don't know what structure RAX now points to, but we know that at that offset 10 within the structure is the preserved offending address. And look at that. The guard page is right there. See the guard page up here? That's right there on the stack too. See how it's highlighted? not the stack, but at that address. So this, whatever the structure is, we could probably build a structure if we figure out what this exactly is. I think it's an undocumented structure though. Inside of it, at these two offsets, are the offender and the guard page. And that's going to be important because we're going to see that get tracked through this function call to the handler. And that's how we're going to know how it's doing its enforcement. So let's go now and make a note of that. So I'm going to go over to IDA. And we're going to go to that location here. Okay, let's RAX what offset was that? That was offset, so 102028. So we'll clean this up better later on because I'm going to want to rename these variables. But now that we know that RAX, then you can see there's a comparison going on against 8000001. That's probably some exception code. And then, yeah, that's the exception code that we saw. Because if we go back over to WinDebug, if we go up a little higher here, there's that exception code. See it? So the 80001 and the other one's the 2. So there's only 2 handlers in this exception handler. It's a very simple exception handler. So going back to IDA, okay, so that's how we make the determination if we go that way or this way. Then we go down here, RAX still holds that structure. And then here we're moving that structure into RCX, or the pointer to that structure. So RAX and RCX both hold that pointer now. So then we go to this function call. We know that RCX, let me zoom in. We know that RCX holds the address of that structure. So RCX, where is RCX? There it is right here. Here we're moving offset 28, which you saw my note before. Offset 28 is actually the address of the guard page. So the guard page is getting moved into RDI. I'll do this properly later and rename the functions, but right now I'm going to say guard page loaded into RDI just to keep track of that. Okay, and then RDI, there's then going to be a comparison down here. RDI gets paired to RAX. So RAX gets clobbered there with whatever's at this location. Which is, again, there's some structure that we don't know about. And then we continue down here. RDI gets compared, and then a determination, decisions being made. We load mitlib state. Mitlib state's a big structure that I think is also undocumented. It might be in there. Let's go see if it's in there real quick. Just thinking about it. Nope, not in there. Let's try specifically saying payload restrictions. Nah, oh well. All right, let's go back over here quick. Just checking them, kind of keep track of my notes here. So we know that we saw the stuff for IAF being checked, but we're looking at EAF right now. We saw the gadget check function call. So I think that when that exception handler gets called, there's a couple checks going on in there for some reason. Because we saw the one specifically for the gadget check as well. We saw that there's a call to PC to file header to grab the faulting module's base address information and symbol name if there is one. Because remember, back before, what we're trying to do is we're trying to determine whether or not the guard page, which is on the exports table, is being accessed by a legitimate caller or an offending caller, someone is not allowed to call it. So who's not allowed to call it based on the description of the mitigation from Microsoft is like malicious code. So dynamically allocated malicious code memory addressing should not be able to call or access the guard page. So we've recorded the faulting address and the guard page address. So now what we need to do is validate that the address of the faulting RIP is within a module that's permitted to access it. And I think that's going to go back to those 3 DLLs that we saw, which are kernel 32, kernel base, and NTDLL. I think that's it. I think we already figured it out. Let's validate some things real quick. All right. So, trying to think what else I want to do. We've got the offender. Let's track that a little bit more. All right, if we go back over here, okay, we know RDI holds the guard page. Let's see where that. There's a comparison down here. There's a comparison here. So RDI doesn't get touched. It's getting checked a couple times. There's comparisons that are determining which edge branch it takes. Go down here. We load the address of the structure called mitlib state, which I don't know what that structure is. We could probably figure that out. RDI still doesn't get touched at all. Down here, we move the address of the guard page into RDX, and then we AND it with this value. And then down here, we compare RAX to RDX, which makes another decision as to whether or not you're going to do what. What are we doing here? Here's a caller to mitlib reader gadget check, base of image. Load the effective address of the base of image RDX. So I'm trying to read through this without taking too much time. Call mitlib report address filter violation. This address filter violation, oh, it's specifically, okay, so this is specifically for export address table filtering. See that? Import address filter, export address filter, export address filter plus. So there's plus, and then there's regular, and then there's import address filter. And this is going to probably determine what logging is going to occur. So if you make it here, that means you did violate something. So we want to understand more about that check then. How do we get there? We call here. So before there, this is where we're clearly getting the address of the offender, because we're getting the header information of the address that accessed the guard page. And then down here we call, but there's going to be, no, there's no jump. If you make it to this, you already are caught. You're an offender. Okay, so it has to happen up higher then. Here's the call to the gadget check. So that's where we saw it's checking the address that called the function against what's, I think, permitted to be used. So it's a gadget check. Gadget's a term we use with return-oriented programming, right? So we saw when we looked at that function that it was doing some disassembly and comparing operands and the instruction. So that's clearly checking to see what instruction was used to access it. So if we go higher than this, I'm just trying to figure out where is it determining who the offender is. Comparing AL to 1, I think that 1, I saw it get set earlier. I think that is the value that once it's determined if you are a address from a malicious source, that value 1 is set. And if it's not set, then that means you aren't an offender. So somewhere up higher needs to be that check to see if you are a permitted DLL address that's allowed to access the guard page. That's the one thing we're missing right here. So somewhere in between the top and that point where I was just talking is going to be that check against those DLLs, NTDLL, kernel 32, and kernel base. Mitlib state. See, the problem here is it's going to take this is going to take a lot more debugging and reversing to figure out exactly how those module addresses are checked. I almost want to try and cheat a little bit and figure out where it actually records the addresses for kernel 32, kernel base, and kernel 32. But to do that, that would take a long time. Just trying to think of a cheat here. All I'm missing is that one. All I got to find out is when that one gets set. So here's that comparison. And I think if I'm correct, that's again, if you are the offender, if you're an offender. So I want to know when that gets set. Yeah, I think what I'll probably do is stop here and because I want to try to spend a little bit of time understanding where it records those valid address ranges who are permitted to access the export table. But we figured it out like that. We're pretty much done. I mean, let's recap one more time from the start. So we turned on EAF and we validated the mitigation was on. At first, it didn't actually turn it on until we went on and turned a couple other mitigations at the same time. That's a bug. That's weird. So once we got it working, great. As soon as we run the program, we hit an exception because the guard page is set. We validated that the guard page is set on the exports table. Oh, that's probably how it's working. So it knows where the guard pages are set, and it's set on those DLLs, kernel 32, kernel base, and NTDLLs exports table. So the fact that it's setting those guard pages, it's recording those guard page ranges somewhere. There's got to be a size and the name of the DLLs or the address of the DLLs. And then when it records the offender, or I mean, it's not an offender until it's doing something wrong, but when it records the actual instruction pointer address that is trying to access using get proc address, the guard page, it checks that against the stored legitimate ones. And if it's not one of those legitimate ones, you get caught. And that's how it validates if what's accessing the exports table of those three DLLs is dynamic code or shellcode, for example. So that's how the mitigation works. So cool. I think I'm pretty happy with that. But what I want to do is clean it up a bit more, understand a little bit more about that question I've been asking, just to validate it, and then re-record this and put it back up. Because I think that'll be good. Any questions though? I'm gonna jump back over here. I haven't seen too many come up. Looks like we lost quite a bit of people, but it's all right. I know it was kind of choppy here and there and stuff like that, but hopefully you feel like you understand this mitigation better, because that's what my goal was, is to know exactly how it works. And one last time, the super high level recap, it simply sets a guard page on the exports table of three DLLs, kernel 32 and DLL kernel base. You have the option with EAF plus to check these other DLLs as well, that shouldn't be accessing things, dangerous ones like flash and stuff. And then once it registers those guard pages, anytime someone goes to access that page, it throws an exception. We saw that it sets the trap flag in the context structure. Specifically, we found the context structure and the reference at offset 44 hex, which was the E flag's position, and it does a bit set on the 8th position, which is the trap flag. That's how it keeps that check going. So when the exception occurs, it records the IP, the instruction pointer address from when we're accessing the guard page. It also records the guard page address, and then it checks to see whether or not the address of the instruction that's trying to access the guard page is within one of those permitted DLLs, NTDLL, kernel base, kernel 32. If it's not being accessed from one of those DLLs, then it catches you, and then it's going to terminate the process, and it will it'll write that to a log. So I think that's the way it works. All right. Took a little longer than I wanted to. Again, apologize for the choppiness and such, but again, I'll re-record this and get it back up, so it'll be a little bit better. But I think this is a useful one as well, so I'll leave this one up there. Also, I will post up soon what our next session is going to be, and also like when my guests are going to be coming on next. So I've got a few people that are agreed to come on to the show. So other than that, have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time. Yeah, some people have been asking for fuzzing. A couple people have been asking for fuzzing, and I've got somebody who wants to do that session. I can do that one too, but I don't want to do all of them. And then I've got a couple requests coming in for people want to learn a little bit more about like scripting with IDA Pro, like how you find bugs using IDA Pro scripting or some other cool things you can do with that. So I think IDA scripting is another good one that we'll do in the near future. But other than that, have a great weekend. We'll see you next time. And I'm done. Almost 2 hours there. So have a great weekend.